So many people think of the witch trials as this messy, unexplained event that was absolute mass hysteria, but actually, there is a very simple explanation behind why all of this happened, and it is the rampant fear of the devil and the rampant fear of women combined together. The trials only actually lasted about a year, ending in May 1693, and the strong belief in the supernatural is what eventually led to them. To understand the Salem witch trials, we should take a step back and look at the Puritan values of this time. Everything was done under the guise of the Puritan religion. Your responsibility in life was to completely abolish idolatry and to eventually get to heaven, which was the ultimate salvation. The fear of the devil was so strong, and every single bad thing that happened to the people in Salem had to have a religious explanation. I mean, anything bad that happened to them, like a storm or a disease, was a sign or a punishment from God that they were either indulging in sin or that they weren't living a godly enough lifestyle. The winters were absolutely freezing and brutal. I mean, we know how cold New England can get now, but imagine it back then in the 1600s when you didn't have proper clothing or food. Every famine, every death was a message from God that the people in Salem were in cahoots with the devil, and this terrified people. This is a very intense time to be alive, and it was not a fun time either. The men usually had the higher up jobs. A lot of them worked in the church or they worked for the minister of the church. So, this all brings us to our first main character or the main instigator at the beginning of the Salem witch trials, Reverend Samuel Parris. Samuel Parris was born in 1653, actually in England, and then he later moved to Boston where he attended Harvard University. From Harvard University, he went to Barbados, where he actually tried to partake in some business ventures. He operated a plantation and then realized he wanted to go back to Massachusetts. So he takes one of his slaves, Tituba, who was a 25 to 30-year-old woman, back to New England with him, and then he eventually settles in the small, struggling village of Salem with her. So this is where he chooses to begin his congregation, and he is not the first, the second, the third, but guys, he is the fourth minister to try and have a congregation in Salem. So we are brought to the first crisis. Samuel Parris has a 9-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old niece. One day, in the freezing cold in January 1692, the two girls begin to have these physical fits. They were convulsing, shaking, screaming, saying inaudible words, and basically just physically freaking out. So their families get very scared, and Samuel Parris calls the town doctor, William Griggs. So William Griggs is called over to examine the girls, and he actually doesn't find any physical evidence that they are being harmed or like that they are ill. So, of course, guys, what conclusion are we brought to? William Griggs diagnoses them with bewitchment. So, yes, we rule out any rational explanation behind this, like seizures, asthma attacks, epilepsy, and we go straight to the idea that the two girls are possessed by witches. Many of the bad things that happened back then had to have a religious backing, so this actually makes perfect sense. So now everybody's wondering, well, how and why are these girls bewitched? Fingers sadly point to Paris's slave, Tituba. So this first accusation is simply a form of discrimination because obviously, since Tituba is a slave, she has no advocation and rights for herself. She can't defend herself against the accusations at all. Tituba is actually the first woman to be formally accused of witchcraft in Salem. And this first accusation is sparking a statewide hysteria. When Tituba is arrested, she actually begins confessing. And at this time, this does not mean that a woman was guilty. By confessing, you could actually place the blame onto other women, and then it takes the spotlight off of you and will place it onto other people. In fact, almost all of the women who were accused eventually in the witch trials had placed the blame on other women and had confessed to sort of try to lighten their trial. So, yes, the trials became a war by men on women, and then a war by men and women on other women and men. So it was everybody against each other, and that's why it became such a big deal. I do want to note that several men were also executed in the witch trials, and I don't want to gloss over that, but because this is women's history, I will be focusing more on the women who were executed because approximately 80% of the people accused and murdered were women. So Tituba actually does say that sadly, Samuel Parris, her owner, had physically harmed and abused her in threats that if she had not admitted to what she did, she would be further harmed by him. Tituba was an extremely vulnerable woman, and the town used her enslaved status to use her as the first poster child that would spark the accused women in Salem. Tituba's confession actually saves her life. Tituba is later released from prison, and sadly, her future life is unknown in history. We don't really know what happened to her after her accusations. Tituba leads us to very well known women in the Salem witch trials that we probably have heard of in school: Bridget Bishop, Sarah Good, and Elizabeth Proctor. Those are the three main names that I have known about for a while. And what all of these women have in common is their vulnerability. People were literally just plucking women off of the street for wearing a bright color and saying that they were witches. It was ridiculous. Many of the accused women had been widowed or had remarried several times or had several children from different husbands. We should talk about the actual court that had upheld the trials and the accusations. The methods and the decisions behind the executions were driven by the Court of Oyer and Terminer. The court was actually specifically implemented for the witch trials because they were getting so ridiculous that people literally could not contain them with the regular court that was in the town. It consisted of 9 judges. The court was a last minute decision by Sir William Phipps, the governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay, because he and the other men around him were getting really scared about the mass amount of accusations that were happening. So the size was getting a lot larger than I think people had thought it would, and it was getting out of hand. So before a formal court trial, the woman would first be physically arrested. The arrest was usually prompted by a verbal complaint by a man, a woman, or a lot of the times in the Salem witch trials, it was a child accusing a grown woman of witchcraft. The craziest part, I think, about the court is that the young girls who were accusing all of these women of being witches were literally used as physical evidence. This is called spectral evidence, meaning their vocal accusations were used as evidence. Many of the girls who were accusing people had actually been left without a physical mark or scratch, so the court was basically just relying on a 3 to 9-year old's verbal warnings about the women who were accused of being witches. If magistrates found that there was solid evidence, they would then be led to a grand jury who would decide whether or not to indict the woman, and then if they did indict them, then they would be led to a formal trial. There was a very common stereotype that people looked for when they were accusing someone of being a witch, and it was usually an eccentric lifestyle. A prime example of this is Bridget Bishop. Bridget Bishop moved to Salem from England, and she had remarried 3 times. Her and her second husband, Thomas Oliver, had allegedly argued all of the time, and they were actually brought to Salem's court several times because they had disturbed their neighbors with the arguments. Oliver dies in 1679, and rumors start to spread that because this is her second husband that has passed away, Bridget Bishop is killing her husbands with bewitchment. She remarries for a third and final time, and she actually moves this husband onto her inherited property that she got from her now dead husband, Thomas Oliver. This was just the cherry on top. The speculation had got so strong that she was eventually arrested. Many people testified against Bridget Bishop, and they had often claimed that she had physically harmed them in terms of like biting or scratching. And while women back then, like Bridget Bishop, did have access to a trial, it was definitely not a trial like we get in modern times. The trial was simply an opportunity that accusers used to place further blame on her, and she actually didn't have a lawyer or any like advocation for herself. She obviously was not able to properly defend herself because over 10 people had come into her trial and accused her. One man even claimed that she had bewitched his child and had caused him to fall ill. All Bridget Bishop had was herself, and this was a common denominator in why the witch trials were so sad and awful. You either proclaim your innocence and probably get executed, or you try to place the blame on somebody else and then you also probably get executed. So this was a lose-lose situation for everybody who was accused. During the Salem witch trials, 20 people were executed, and one of them was actually a man named Giles Corey. Giles Corey had refused to take a plea deal because he wanted his children to inherit his property, and he was actually pressed to death. Yes, he was pressed to death, meaning that rocks were pushed up against him so hard and so forcefully that he eventually lacked oxygen to live and was executed in a brutal, brutal way. The Salem witch trials were deeply rooted in chronic stress. This also led to a lot of misogyny within the church as well. And by misogyny in the church, I mean that there was a strong ideology that women were the physically and mentally weaker gender or weaker sex, and this meant that they were more vulnerable to demonic possession. They were more prone to spiritual corruption, or at least that's what they thought in the Puritan religion, and this led to a lot of misogynistic discrimination towards them. The credibility for the Salem witch trials was lacking for a long, long time. The witch trials were absolutely an act of panic, where women were mainly used as the puppets to show that demonic possession was not allowed in the town of Salem. We see a complete and utter destruction of reason, of rationality, of actual proof, and all of this was the perfect cocktail for the church to establish absolute domination over its people. So, after so many people had died by execution and in jail, Sir William Phipps, who actually established the Court of Oyer and Terminer, as I mentioned earlier, his wife was accused of witchcraft, and this is what promptly ended the witch trials. He absolutely knew that his wife was innocent and that she had been following the religious guidelines strictly, so there was no way she could have been a witch. So when she was accused of witchcraft, he said, absolutely not. This has to come to an end, and spectral evidence was now thrown out the window and not able to be used in trial. So by May 1693, everybody who was still in jail or on trial to be executed was pardoned by Sir William Phipps, and he decided to let go of all of the witch trial accusations. A new superior court was formed that rejected spectral evidence, meaning that dreams and verbal accusations could no longer be used as evidence in court. It is sad to say, but the government only called it quits pretty much because the higher class citizens of Salem were being accused of witchcraft and not because of how many people were killed. The Salem witch trials are such a strong example of the power of fear and how fear can simply overpower every single rational part about how we live as people. I actually recently just took a trip to Salem a couple weeks ago, and it really did spark the idea to do a video on the witch trials because I was so fascinated by all of the evidence they still have in the town of Salem. I hope you enjoyed the second episode of Once Upon a Woman History, and I will see you on the next one.